The genesis of this lecture guestship is rooted in the care for our students, the values of our campus community, and the questions of social justice. Beginning in 1999-2000, the community here started to ask some very serious questions about our lecture series and about how we could encourage our LGBTQ community. And in that period, we invited the Reverend Greg Dell, who had just been suspended as a United Methodist pastor down in Chicago in Boys Town. He had done a same-sex wedding at his church and was suspended for a year. And so during that time, we hosted him here on campus. And in the middle of that period, our student group started to take shape, what is now called QSA. Also in that time, the Staff and Faculty for Equality, SAFE, a faculty staff group that was charged with thinking about how do we help support our community. And indeed, in that period, same-sex benefits were offered to those members of our staff and faculty who were partnered, not yet able to marry by the state. In the middle of that, Alan Ray came. And as he came as our president, he took the idea of a concept of a lecture and agreed that we needed a name for it. At that point, we had several named lectures that were part of the cultural lecture series. And there were many names that were put on the table, but he then understood that there was really only one name that represents an alum of the college, that of Reinhold and Richard Niebuhr in the Niebuhr Lecture, the oldest lecture of the college. And so he was persuaded, as we talked and listened to other people's naming, that the name of the Reverend Dr. William Johnson, graduate class of 1968, would be the person that we would name this lecture after. Bill Johnson graduated from Elmhurst in 68 and went to Pacific School of Religion, where he took ordination credentials and grading for a master's in divinity. He graduated in 1972 and was ordained, and he is the first person ordained by the United Church of Christ openly gay. Now, we have been ordaining people gay for years and years and centuries, but this was the first time the denomination said yes publicly to someone who was gay. And in that period, he became then part of a national movement of the conflict that was going on in the greater society, certainly in the church. He's online right now. We're doing a big shout out to Bill in Los Angeles. And in the middle of all that, one should know that Bill also went to New York City and established the first LGBT church group at Riverside Church called Maranatha, which means in Greek, fellowship. And that group still is going. It was the first group in the nation. And we understand that this lecture, rooted in those reasons of care for our community, questions of social justice, the values and ethics, leads to us saying yes to the Johnson guestship. And so when people ask me why this, I always refer to the history that brought us there, bringing great commanding speakers that help engage our campus community, but also history is not static or neutral. One only has to note what is happening today with Pope Francis and his announcements about same-sex marriage and civil unions. Today we are in another great moment. Today we are in a place where we get to think about these conversations through the lens of an unbelievable presenter. And so with joy, I have the privilege to invite one of our faculty members who will then introduce our guest speaker today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joshua Vandersal as he brings a wonderful person to our campus community to speak. Blessings to all of you. Good day.
Josh, I'm so sorry. I meant to announce this to begin with because officially I'm supposed to do this. We are recording this lecture, so I'm sorry, I apologize, but I just wanted everyone to know that. So if for whatever reason you don't want to be recorded, now's your time to exit. Sorry.
No worries. Thanks, Mary Kay, and thank you, Scott. So I have the unique pleasure today of introducing a friend of mine and excellent scholar, Dr. August Stockwell. They use they, them pronouns, and they are a researcher, an educator, and executive director of Upswing Advocates in Chicago, which is a nonprofit organization that provides training and research opportunities supporting the LGBTQ2IA community. August is a neurodivergent, queer, and non-binary human, and they are also the Associate Director of Research in the Applied Behavior Analysis Department at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Their research topics include gender, sexual behavior, mindfulness, non-monogamy, communication in relationships, neurodiversity, cultural considerations, and effective skill building strategies. So please join me in welcoming August as we welcome them to Elmhurst University, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you so much. And I would love to share my slides with you. I think I need screen sharing to be enabled on my end, so I can do that.
That makes two things I was supposed to do that I forgot. Sorry about that, August. And do you want it under the phone number and the name?
There we go.
Is that good? Okay.
Yes, this is great. Fantastic. And I'm going to sit a little bit close to my computer so I have kind of a close-up of my face because I want to make sure that my computer picks up my voice for captioning. All right, excellent. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today to talk about liberation access, neurodiversity, and disability justice in LGBTQ2IA work. This is a huge topic. This is 3 huge topics, and we've got an hour. So I won't be able to say everything that I want to say, but I think my hope is that I'll be able to share some information that you can take with you that's going to be meaningful and some kind of opportunity for next steps in your growth in this area. Oops. There we go. So the main areas that I'll be covering today are finding a shared language to talk about these topics, dismantling oppressive systems and building systems that work better for us in terms of liberation, and then moving away from a saviorism kind of approach of thinking about disability and neurodiversity, and instead showing up in solidarity and what that looks like in our lives. And I wanted to acknowledge these people. These are some of the people who've been most influential in my skill development and just education in this area. These are people who have taught me about LGBTQ2IA liberation. They've taught me about neurodiversity. And in particular, Terry Lynn Hudson and Carrie Sarah Kaufman have taught me about disability justice and what accessibility processes look like in community. Some of the main points from this talk are going to be sort of adapted from a paper that I wrote with Warner Leland and Johnny Vidia, so I wanted to acknowledge that. And I want to also acknowledge that a lot of the neurodiversity specific content is coming from co-creation with Lee Nethercott, a friend and colleague of mine, and then also a focus group that Upswing Advocates did with neurodiverse queer community members in Chicago. So we do a training on neurodiversity, and we wanted to make sure that it was directly informed by the community. So that's why we did the focus group, and so that's what the content is informed by today. So starting point, a little bit about me. So Josh already said that I'm a queer, transgender, neurodivergent person. I also identify as somebody with living with mental illness, and I have some differences in my auditory processing. Some other identities that I hold are that I'm white, I'm educated, and I consider myself to be able-bodied. So we all come to this topic with different lived experiences and different identities, and I wanted to acknowledge that those are the ones that I'm coming to this topic with. And I think everybody knows this event is being recorded. And I also wanted to share that at this link, you can access these slides in case you're somebody who likes to read along on your own, and so that you'll have a copy for later. And there's also some other resources and things in that folder. So this topic is professionally relevant for me. It's also, you know, academic, but really it's personal because it relates to a lot of my identities and lived experiences, and it also is relevant to my community and people that I care about so much. So lots of background in terms of why I'm coming to these topics today. Context that I always begin with in my presentations and in my trainings is the idea of cultural humility. Turvalon and Garcia are two Black women researchers who coined this term, cultural humility, and I really like it rather than a goal of cultural competence, which we can kind of sometimes think of as like trying to get it all right or trying to have a complete sense of knowledge around a certain topic. That may not always be doable. Language is always shifting. Different people are going to have different experiences, so we can't always have a perfect understanding. But what we can have is humility and openness to growth and openness to learning over time. And I'm going to be providing image descriptions during this presentation too. So the image on this slide is a tweet by Travis Alabanza, and it says, "Being understood should not be a prerequisite for care and safety." And I think this is important because even as we are trying to wrap our brains around these concepts of LGBTQ2IA liberation and neurodiversity and disability justice, that's going to be a process, and that's okay. And what really matters is how we're showing up for people. Are we showing up with actions that indicate care, and are we creating safe and affirming environments for everyone? So this acronym, LGBTQ2IA, it's one of the longer versions that you've probably seen before. And at Upswing, we spent a lot of time talking about what we wanted the acronym to be that we were sort of working from. And this one is pretty comprehensive, or it involves more terms than it potentially could. So I want to spell these out. We felt like it was important to explicitly include these identities and acknowledge them in the work that we're doing. So this acronym stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer and questioning, two-spirit, intersex, and asexual and aromantic. So really briefly what those signify, they mean different things. So even though they're all in one acronym, there's sort of different contexts for them. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual, we can think of as describing sexual attraction based on others' gender. Transgender is not a sexual orientation, but rather a way of describing somebody's gender identity and the way that it aligns to their sex that they were assigned at birth. Queer and questioning can refer either to gender or sexuality. Two-spirit is a term that is sometimes used in some indigenous communities to talk about a particular set or group of gender identities or a social role within a community based on gender. Intersex is kind of a blanket term to talk about differences in sex development. So those are really at the physical level, whether those are genetic differences, hormonal differences, or certain differences in body parts and things like that. All normal human variations. And then finally, asexual and aromantic relate to sexual or romantic attraction variability based on context or internal factors. So I could give a whole talk about all of that, but I'm going to move on today and show this image too. So a little bit more of an explanation of the term transgender. This image shows an umbrella, and the text over it says the trans umbrella. And what you see is on the left, there are two terms, cisgender men and cisgender women. They are not under the trans umbrella because these are people assigned male at birth who identify as men, and people assigned female at birth who identify as women. Under the trans umbrella, we have transgender men and transgender women. And then also under the transgender umbrella, we have non-binary people. So there are so many identities, but these are just a few examples. Agender, gender fluid, bigender, genderqueer, and there are many, many more. And I also want to point out that many non-binary people also identify as transgender, but not all of them do. So on this slide, there are 3 different images. The one on the left shows a genderqueer person talking to a therapist. They're sitting on a couch with a cane resting next to them. In the middle is a group of 5 friends of varying genders posing while one person holds up their phone to take a picture. And then on the right, 2 colleagues, a transgender woman and a non-binary person, are laughing in a meeting at work. So I show these pictures. There's a little bit of information underneath here about the Gender Spectrum Collection, which is a stock photo collection. And I show these pictures to, help to illustrate that when we think about the LGBTQ2IA community, that's not the only identity that somebody holds. There are people of all races and all ages and all abilities and all neurotypes, and any other sort of demographic variable or identity you can think of within that community. And it's just one example, between 55 and 70% of autistic adults identify as being LGBTQ2IA in some way. So there is a significant intersection between a lot of these different communities, and it's important to acknowledge that. Acting in solidarity with LGBTQ2IA people is definitely not a one-issue consideration. Queer and trans people can be neurodivergent, physically disabled, living with chronic pain, etc. So when we're focusing on, for example, building gender-affirming practices, that's really also tightly interwoven with racial justice and disability justice and reproductive justice and housing justice and all of these issues that we can work on together as a group. Multiple forms of discrimination can overlap and create unique and cumulative experiences of oppression and organization. Racism and transphobia can intersect and produce a compounded impact. For just one example, there's a graph on this slide that shows data from the 2015 US Trans Survey. It was the largest transgender survey carried out in the US to date, with over 27,000 respondents. And what it shows here is the percentage of transgender women who reported any housing discrimination or housing instability in the past year due to being transgender. And so you can see, on average, it was 30% of respondents, but when it's broken down according to race, you can see that Black transgender women experienced it at a rate of nearly 50%. So this is an example of how transphobia and racism can intersect to produce compounded effects. And so it's important not to talk about just the transgender community as a whole or the LGBT community as a whole, but really be sensitive to these intersections and how they're going to powerfully impact different people's lived experiences and the barriers that they experience and their needs and ways that they can be best supported. Another statistic that I think is important to mention is that disabled people make up between 1/3 and 1/2 of the people who are killed by the police in the United States. And Black, Indigenous, people of color, and queer and transgender people are at increased risk as well. So a sobering statistic, certainly. And another example of why we need to think about all of these identities and experiences together. So we can ask, does everybody have access to what they need? What barriers are there? How can we remove these barriers? Are systems set up to ensure access? And how can we promote that? So when we think about power, privilege, and oppression, there are lots of different isms you can talk about: racism, sexism, et cetera. But today, I think the most relevant one to focus on is ableism. So before we can really begin to talk about neurodiversity, we need to start by talking about ableism. Discrimination, social prejudice, and the systemic creation of barriers for people with disabilities is how we can think about ableism. We can think about it as an existence of systems that are set up and provide supports that only benefit those who are neurotypical. It can also mean systems that are set up as attempts to be accommodating to folks with disability and neurodivergent folks, but are created by people who are not part of the community and don't actually meet that need. So they're not directly informed by those who need those supports. So we want to move away from ableism, and we want to move away from oppression and barriers that are present in our society right now. And so it's a call to liberation. And there's all sorts of different definitions of what liberation is. We can think about it in terms of rights and in terms of opportunities, in terms of choice. And when I think about liberation, I think about the work of Israel Golddiamond. He was a clinical behavior analyst who did work, therapy work in the 60s and 70s and did a lot of publishing as well. And he talked about this idea of degrees of freedom. So in a given situation, how many options are available to you? Is there one, or are there multiple? So in a situation with only one response option, even though someone might be able to access a resource, there's really no choice available. So it's sort of a coercive contingency where there's not a lot of freedom. So you can think about, for example, a transgender person who needs to access medical care. And there's one doctor that's available or accessible to them. But perhaps that doctor is not very well versed in trans medical competency, and they aren't able to provide helpful information, and they use language that's hurtful. So in that situation, that person certainly deserves more choice in terms of where they're accessing their medical care, and not just one response option, right? Freedom involves more than ensuring that people have access to valued resources. It requires us expanding those degrees of freedom, thinking about them as accessing something valued. So this could be basic resources, this could be social connection, anything that's valued, really. So liberation means that people are free to respond based on their individual values. It doesn't mean that everybody has access to one resource, thinking about legal marriage as one example. Because not everybody necessarily wants to be married, so there should be other avenues that are available as well. So rather than assimilation into dominant systems and situations where there are limited options, liberation really means the freedom for us to all create our lives and have freedom to engage in different response options to access the things that we need and the things that we care about. There are lots of different topics that I can talk about today when I think about oppressive systems and practices that relate to ableism, and especially with regard to neurodiversity. And we can think about white supremacy as sort of an overarching one, where barriers and discrimination can occur when whiteness is privileged over or made the default, and privileged over other practices of other groups, whether those are practices around gender, sexuality, ability, or neurotype. So those other practices may be minimized or erased because they fall outside of those dominant white systems. We could also talk about heteronormativity. So norms around, quote unquote traditional man-woman monogamous relationships, and how those might limit what relationships look like. As well as cisnormativity. So this sort of westernized idea of the gender binary of there's only a man and a woman, and each one, these two roles are distinct, they can't intersect, and each one has very particular gender roles that are ascribed to them. So moving outside of that creates a lot more freedom as well. We can also talk about capitalism and charity. So I'll do that in a few slides. We'll talk more about ableism, and then also go into detail about the medical model. And how that system can be oppressive, and what the alternative is to that. Throughout westernized history, there are different models of disability that have been used, so either academically or just sort of in people's everyday language. These are sort of the themes that are coming up. I do want to note that this is westernized in particular, so there are other cultures where there may be different types of paradigms that aren't mentioned here today. But today I want to talk about the moral the medical and the social model, and some of the implications for each of these. So in the moral model, any disability or difference in functioning or neurology is viewed as being either a sin or sort of a personal flaw, or based on making some sort of error. And this, sorry, my cat is getting a little close here. This is something that can still show up today, and it can lead to people sort of experiencing self-stigma about disability or neurodivergence. Next on this slide is an image. It says the medical model of disability. There's a picture of a person, and there's a circle around them. It says the individual. The person's frowning and wearing a t-shirt that says the problem. And it says, around the person it says problem, 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 and arrows are all pointing inside toward the person. It says impairments and chronic illness often pose real difficulties, but they are not the main problems. In this traditional view, disability is caused by physical, mental, and sensory impairment. The individual is impaired. The individual is the problem. So this is sort of a deficit model of the issue being within the individual. And there is a focus of the medical profession to find a cure or to alleviate the effects. And there's that focus on the impairment. This is a model that developed in the mid-1800s, where disability or difference or neurodivergence is seen as something to be fixed. This is a model that views a healthcare professional as the expert and can sometimes ignore the needs or the autonomy of a client or patient. This can lead to harmful messages, especially for folks who may have a disability or a neurodivergent identity that they hold as part of who they are. So for example, for somebody who identifies as autistic, to see messages that people are looking for a cure for autism, for example, can be deeply hurtful. Essentially, that message of trying to eradicate people. So we can think about this as potential limitations or negative impacts of the model of disability. And then third is the social model of disability. Here there is a picture of a person again with a circle around them, and the circle says society, and all around the person it says barriers, but the arrows are pointing out towards society. It says societal barriers, environment is inaccessible, and then under that it says buildings, services, language, communication, and then attitudes, and under that it says prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination. And then organizations, under that it says inflexible procedures and practices. So an impairment, according to this model, happens because of the barriers that are created by society and maintained by prejudice and a lack of support at the systemic level. So the issue is not within the individual, but rather a social environment that is not designed in a way to be accessible and affirming and inclusive. So this social model moves the focus away from seeing the problem as being within the individual and pointing to the environment instead, which I think is great because we can change the environment, right? We can change social situations, we can change physical environments, we can change the way different systems and organizations are set up. So there's an opportunity for change. And here, disabilities are viewed as variations of the human experience. Neurodivergent people also experience discrimination in ways that differ from other minority groups, and this model allows us to kind of talk about some of those things. On the slide, there's an arrow with two different pointing ends. On the left, it says moral model and medical model. The message is disability is a problem. The goal is it needs to be fixed. And then on the right, it says social model. Message is disability is a natural form of diversity. The goal is accommodate disability with optimal outcomes. So this is the invitation to move toward the social model and imagine what that looks like for all of us. So in talking about a social model of disability, it really leads us right to this idea of disability justice. And from the SINS Invalid website, I have some of the main points that were listed here. Disability justice framework understands these different things. All bodies are unique and essential. They all have strengths, and also they all have needs that must be met. We're powerful not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of those complexities. And finally, all bodies are confined by ability, race, gender, sexuality, class, nation, state, religion, and more. We can't separate these things. This image shows the 10 principles of disability justice, and you'll probably notice some of the common themes listed here, kind of interwoven throughout the rest of the presentation. So first is the principle of intersectionality. Audre Lorde says, we don't live single issue lives. Ableism, as I mentioned, is really interwoven with other types of oppression. And so by working for disability liberation, that's going to aid other types of liberation as well. The second is leadership of those who are most impacted. So rather than external experts coming in and making recommendations or sort of driving the ship in terms of changes that are made, we're led by those who most know the system. So those who can share what the direct impacts are of the ableist systems that need to be changed. The third is an anti-capitalist politic. So in an economy that sees land and humans as components of profit, disability justice is anti-capitalist by the nature of having non-conforming body and mind. So valuing bodies and minds outside of the context of whether they can make money and be productive in a traditional sense. Fourth is a commitment to cross-movement organizing. So social justice movements leading to politics of alliance with other movements. Fifth is recognizing wholeness. So the statement that people have inherent worth outside of commodity relations and capitalist notions of productivity. And each person is full of history and life experience, really valuing the individual and their lived experience. Sixth is sustainability. This is about pacing ourselves individually and collectively to be sustainable long-term. So as I mentioned later on, rather than getting wrapped up in a sense of urgency about what changes need to be made, how can we plan for the long haul? How can we plan for our actions to be sustainable? The seventh is a commitment to cross-disability solidarity. So neurodivergent people, people with chronic pain, people with visual impairments, people with ADHD and bipolar and intellectual disabilities. All of these unique experiences are opportunities for collaboration and mutual support. And that leads me right into interdependence. So we meet each other's needs as we build toward liberation. Ninth is collective access. And this says, as brown, black, and queer-bodied disabled people, we bring flexibility and creative nuance that go beyond able-bodied and able-minded normativity to be in community with each other. And then finally, collective liberation. No body or mind can be left behind. Only moving together can we accomplish the revolution that we require. So those are some big points and really, complex and kind of monumental things to think on and how they might inspire us and how they might fit into the actions that we take in the days and the months to come. So disability justice is pretty broad. It encompasses any sort of disability of any kind. Neurodiversity is specific within that. And this image shows an infinity symbol that is made out of lots of different colors, which is one of the common images that is associated with the neurodiversity movement. And as I talk about this and all of these other terms, I do want to mention that language is always evolving, and it's also used differently in different contexts and different social groups. So any definitions that I put forth today, it's a definition, it's not the definitive definition, and so we can just kind of be flexible about that. But here's one definition of neurodiversity. It's a concept where neurological differences are to be recognized and respected as any other human variation. So, and we think about neurodiversity, diversity meaning that there's a range, there's a spectrum, right? It's not just one thing, it's not just two things, it's so many things. And within that, we can talk about being neurotypical. This can be defined as having a style of neurocognitive functioning that falls within dominant societal standards. So this doesn't mean having a normal brain, it just means having a brain that is falling within the statistically significant norm of a given culture. Neurotypical is on the continuum, it's not really a positive or negative term. So just like we wouldn't say gay and straight are positive or negative, neurotypical and neurodivergent are also not positive or negative, they're just descriptors. It's also not the opposite of autistic. So there are many different types of neurodiversity and autistic is just one of them. We can also think about the term neurodivergent. So divergent meaning to move away from. Having a brain that functions in ways that diverge significantly from the dominant societal standards. And for some people, these types of divergence can directly impact the way that they experience the world and their perceptions. For other people, they may not so much. Some people may see their neurodivergence as deeply important and central to who they are as a person. Other people may not see it that way. It's really just going to depend on the person. When we talk about like who's under the neurodiversity umbrella, who could we potentially consider to be neurodivergent, these are a few different categories or identities. And of course, it's going to depend on the person who might have this diagnosis or these collection of experiences resonates for them, whether they consider it to be a disorder or whether they consider it to be an identity, whether or not they consider themselves to be neurodivergent. That's really just going to depend. But these are some examples of what might be considered to fall within the neurodiversity umbrella. And we always want to honor the language that a person uses to describe their neurodivergence and whether they even identify as being neurodivergent at all. But the key here is these are any difference in the brain whatsoever. This can be neurological differences, developmental differences, intellectual or mental differences, etc. So what does it look like to move away from saviorism and towards solidarity in our everyday life? What does it look like to move toward justice and liberation and create affirming and accessible spaces? So we'll talk a little bit about that. So some practical things. But first, some alternatives. So in our society, I think we hear a lot of ableist messages. So either these are sort of subtle and insidious, or we hear them outright. And kind of unpacking that can be really necessary. So we may hear that worth is linked to economic productivity or sort of language around like functioning levels, particularly with being autistic. And this language is really harmful. So instead, we can affirm that all humans inherently have worth, regardless of employable skills and regardless of supports that are needed. Legal marriage and changes in income can mean a loss of disability supports for some. And so we can affirm that all humans deserve access to resources, personal autonomy, and care, and that this should not be contingent on whether or not they're accessing other resources that everyone deserves to access, like legal marriage, for example. There's an emphasis on self-care, and so this is really an invitation to explore what community care would look like, supporting others and others supporting you within a community context. So self-care is also great, but I think it really does a disservice to people to point them only to self-care when they're hurting or they need support. Also, moving away from this idea of charity, which typically can look like donating your money to help people who have less money or volunteering to help those who are, quote unquote, less fortunate. There is a power hierarchy that's present there. So instead, the invitation today is to look at a mutual aid arrangement where there is no power hierarchy, but people are giving and receiving and linking each other with resources and getting basic needs met on the community level. For us, the work can begin internally as well as externally. We can start noticing, investigating our stereotypes, the assumptions and the misconnections that are coming up for us, and how our own upbringing maybe led to those. And we can notice the ways the society is set up best for people of just one subset of the population and not others. And notice our relation to that. Do we benefit from how society is currently set up? Or is that really not what works best for us, but we're sort of gritting our teeth and doing our best because that's just how things have always been done? Or are they set up in ways where it's so far outside of what works for us, we just can't always engage in the things that we want to or we need to? We can work together to create accessible spaces. I think for a lot of us, when we hear accessibility, the first thing that might come to mind is space being wheelchair accessible, but accessibility is about so many other things as well. We can think about what's needed for somebody to get there to a space or a space or an event or a resource. What's needed for them to actually engage in a meaningful way and get what they need out of that experience. And a hugely important variable here is it financially accessible? Because even if something is physically accessible, it's meaningful, and all of these things, if it's not financially accessible for somebody, they will not be able to benefit from it. And that can be a really, really huge barrier, even as we tackle other types of barriers too. So this is why Upswing Advocates advocate so hard for therapists and other helping professionals to really prioritize offering pro bono and sliding scale services so that people of all income levels are able to access care, because everybody deserves that. Creating accessible spaces also involves providing information about how a space or event is set up ahead of time. So if you live somewhere where there are stairs, at least making that point clear ahead of time can help somebody make an informed decision about whether they're able to navigate that space or not. And then finally, have ongoing conversations about accessibility needs. I think this is probably one of the most important points of the whole presentation. We can assume what the norms are, we can assume what the default is, but it doesn't work well for everybody. So by having conversations and asking, what are your accessibility needs? How does this need to be set up so that it works okay for you, so that you can access it and really benefit? And not just doing that one time, but having those conversations on an ongoing basis. I wanted to read this quote from the book Care Work by Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samasina, who says, most of the time, access is placed on the individual who needs it. It's up to you to figure out your own access, or sometimes up to you and your caregiver, personal attendant, or random friend. It's often isolated and relegated to an afterthought. Access is complex. It's more than just having a ramp or getting disabled folks or crits into the meeting. Access is a constant process that doesn't stop. So really important to think about that. So we've got about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to go through what this looks like at the concrete level. So when we are navigating a physical space, I know we're doing that a little bit less now than we were before the pandemic, but I think these things will be important in the long run for sure. Can everybody get to the physical space? And also, is there an alternative to attend virtually for folks who that may not be very doable for? Are there wheelchair accessible, gender neutral bathrooms available? Because there are transgender people who use wheelchairs who will need those. Are there chairs that will work well for people with bodies of different sizes? Or are there only very narrow chairs with armrests? We want to limit outside noise, especially for folks with auditory processing challenges and anxiety, and avoiding strong scents like perfume. So this can trigger different medical issues for different folks. So in creating an accessible space, That can look like not using air fresheners, asking people not to wear cologne or perfumes or oils or things like that. In social interactions, we want to never require somebody to make eye contact or penalize or read into them not making a lot of eye contact. For some folks, it's actually either uncomfortable or downright painful to be required to make eye contact. And many people actually learn best or listen best or interact best by not looking at somebody and just listening instead. So it's really important to support that and allow for that. Never touch or help people without their consent. So this looks like, for example, if someone's trying to get through a door, you don't want to assume that they need your help, and they probably have a system that they use to do that, and you would be really messing up that system. So asking is fine, but absolutely respecting somebody's answer is critical. And don't give unsolicited advice. So for folks with chronic pain or folks who might struggle with some aspects of neurodivergence, they have probably already looked up a lot of potential interventions or supports. And so anything that pops into your head, it's probably not the first time that they will have heard it. And only give advice basically if you've been asked to give it. And instead, just create space for folks to just be who they are and show up as they are on that day. We can allow people to stand and move around and take breaks. Be mindful of our assumptions. We can't know somebody's gender or sexuality by looking at them. We also can't know if somebody has a disability just by looking at them, or always if they're neurodivergent by looking at them. And then avoid asking personal questions about people's disabilities or about their gender transition, etc. So essentially, don't make it weird is the overarching rule there, right? Treat people with kindness, be mindful of your assumptions, and be genuine in your interactions with people. In care work, Leah also says this, and I think this is really important, especially in academic circles. Figure out how to communicate using smaller words, not academic words, different words than you just tried. Writing. It's waiting for someone to be done finishing spelling out a sentence on their augmented communication device before responding. It's using text. It's not assuming that oddest and academic ways of communicating are the smartest or the best. And here we can think about oddest ways of communicating could be speaking vocally versus, for example, using sign language or all of the other alternatives, all the many ways that people can communicate. So for communication, we often do have a default way of communicating, which is, depends on the situation, but often it's listening to a voice and speaking vocally. And that doesn't always work well for everybody in all situations. So we want to allow for different ways of receiving information. So whether that's written or spoken or anything else, and also allow people the option to express themselves in a variety of different ways too. So maybe vocally, using a communication device, signs, gestures, by typing or writing out their responses, including after the fact, if it takes some time for people to process some things. All of those things can be offered as an option. Also, I know that some folks find it meaningful to draw or paint in order to facilitate communication. So all of that can be really helpful, just moving away from the idea that there's one best way to do a meeting or a classroom or a hangout, and offering these options to see what works best with each person. More on communication. Offering visual supports can be really helpful. So captions, for example, today would be an example. Pictures that go along with spoken words, image descriptions that go with images, transcripts to read along as you listen to something, handouts in order for people to prepare for an event, an agenda to know what to expect. That can make all the difference in terms of somebody's processing and planning abilities. It can also make a lot of difference in terms of anxiety, to not have that anxious response of the uncertainty of what's happening next, because you've already been given an agenda and you know what's going to happen next. And then finally, using a microphone. Even if the room is small, even if you identify as somebody with a loud booming voice, There are still going to be some people who really need that microphone to be used. Deaf and hard of hearing folks, but also just folks with different auditory processing challenges where it may be really difficult to filter out the sound of other people talking and focus on a presenter, for example. We want to use affirming language, following a person's lead on whether to use identity or person first language. I think in academia, I know that for my experience, I was drilled to use person first language, so person with blank or person experiencing blank. But for many folks, they use identity for first language and want others to do that too. So this image has the text that says, "I'm not a neurotypical person with an autism add-on. I am autistic." And it's really important to mirror the language that people are using for themselves. That's just respect and basic decency and care. We also want to avoid loaded language like suffers from a certain condition or is confined to a wheelchair or burdened by something. We can just speak neutrally. So somebody received a diagnosis or somebody uses a wheelchair or somebody identifies as blank or experiences blank. And affirmation also looks like using the right name and pronouns that somebody asks you to use. So I'm going to speak quickly about pronouns here. Again, from the 2015 US Trans Survey of over 27,000 people, this question asked people to report what pronouns they ask other people to use for them. At 37%, people said they want people to use he, him. 37% also said she, her. The next most common at 29% was they, them. 2% was ze and here, which is a neo-pronoun example. 4% said none, or just use my name. 20% said don't ask to use specific pronouns at all. So this could either be they're not comfortable asking people to use certain ones, or they maybe just don't have a strong preference. And then 4% asked people to use pronouns that were just not listed in the survey. So I show this, A, because it's really interesting and just shows the variety of transgender people's use of language and what they need other folks to use, but also to point out the 29% for they, them. So that's almost a third of all participants. And these were young people, these were older people, people of all ages. So if using they, them pronouns is something that's new for you, I guarantee that you will continue to interact with people who use they, them pronouns. So practicing and getting fluent is going to be so meaningful to providing affirming and respectful spaces. Using a pronoun that a person has asked you to use is just as important as using somebody's correct name. And we want to use the correct language even when somebody's not present. This is a new skill for many people. It may not come naturally, but like any new skill, practice is what it takes. So here's an image that shows an example of what it's like to be corrected and to correct your language in the moment. The person on the left says, "So I was hanging out with James the other day and he said." The person on the right says, "They said." And then the person on the left again says, "Right, thanks. Guess what they said to me?" So this is a great example because the person on the right is offering correction in the moment, which is really what's needed for behavior to change. And then the person on the left is welcoming this feedback. They're saying thanks. And this is a really great perspective. I know it can be uncomfortable to be corrected. It can also be uncomfortable to try and correct others. But this is really being done in the service of connection and maintaining relationships and being known by others. So even any uncomfortable feelings that are coming up, it's being done because of connection, and it's important to keep going with the process. And the more you practice, the better you get. I also wanted to add in this slide about making research studies accessible for participation, or for participants. If you haven't already looked into it, community participatory action research models are really fantastic in that they center the community being researched from start to finish, including even designing what the study is going to be about and how it goes about and how the information is shared. Researchers should collaborate with members of the participant community. So rather than coming into a community and saying, I want to study you and publish papers on this community, look at, get to know that community and find out who's already doing this work within the community, and how can you show up and support them versus coming from the outside to try and do that work, thinking about it for the first time. We can ask who's benefiting from the research. Ensure that your community studied is being centered and directly benefits from your research. So when we think about researchers and the ways that they benefit, it can lead to tenure, promotions, increases in salary, increases in notoriety. And we want to make sure that if we are doing research and benefiting, that we're not just keeping those benefits for ourselves, but we're sharing those with and passing those along to the community that's being studied, who's directly impacted maybe by these different systemic things that we're studying. We want to ask about pronouns and accessibility needs. Typically, I do this in the first session with my participants. So what pronouns do you want me to use for you? And then as I write up a study, I use those pronouns as I talk about the different participants versus assuming after the fact. Same thing with asking about gender. Also asking about accessibility needs to find out what they need in order to be able to fully engage as a research participant, to make the meetings, to contact the different interventions, and to have a good experience. Asking that open-ended question is so valuable. It's super crucial to pay participants, especially if you are working with folks who have been impacted by oppression and discrimination, and you're asking them about that experience. They're providing their expertise, they're also providing emotional labor, and they deserve to be compensated and recognized for that labor that they're providing. We want to provide flexible scheduling to participants, flexible procedures. So I did a study on the impact of mindfulness meditation, and we did a lot of modifications to the exercises, to the rooms. We added in breaks, all sorts of different changes versus keeping it exactly as it was originally written, because the way it was written originally wasn't going to work for those people. So we made modifications. Offering in-person versus remote options for research participation is huge as well. And then finally, there are a lot of barriers in terms of accessing scientific and academic information because a lot of it is behind a paywall. Not to mention a lot of it's written in very technical academic language that's not always accessible for people to read who might care to know those things. So the encouragement here is publish open source whenever possible. And when that's not possible, share documents freely with other people. Share your resources freely with others. It can also be really great to create a plain language version of something that's written in very technical language so that that information is available to other people as well. All right, a few more slides here. This image shows a person next to a car, and the person next to that one is holding their foot and crying. And the person next to the car says, "I didn't mean to run over your foot, I'm a good driver." So I share this basically to say that even if we value working against ableism and we value being anti-oppressive, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that our actions are in line with our values. So it's really up to us to notice our actions and notice their impact. Is it having an impact beyond us receiving praise or recognition for those behaviors? Is it actually leading to decreases in oppressive consequences? Is it really leading to increases in accessible environments for others? So really, what is the impact? And how can we continue to be mindful of that? Welcome that discomfort. So doing this kind of work is going against the grain, it's going against the stream with all the other fish going the other way. So we might feel uncomfortable when we receive feedback, when we say or do something hurtful. We might get pushback or disapproval from other people, especially folks in power who might be invested in keeping things the same and not changing things the way we want to, and the way communities that are impacted want to. Sometimes we won't know the best thing to do in a certain situation or the next step to get to liberation, sitting with that uncertainty. And finally, it might feel uncomfortable to know how much we still have left to learn, because there's always so much. So I just invite everybody to welcome that discomfort. It's going to be there, and that's okay. And it may just be there while we continue doing the work. And sometimes discomfort just tells us that something is important or that something is something that we care about. So we can look at it with curiosity and remind ourselves why we value working toward LGBTQ2IA liberation and a better world. So the role here, we can all analyze our own strengths, capacities, and boundaries. Not everybody needs to be at the very front of a protest with a megaphone. Not everybody has the emotional or mental bandwidth to do that. Not everybody has the physical ability to do that. There are so many different ways to create a positive impact and advocate. We can set concrete, measurable goals for action. So setting a goal of trying to be less ableist or starting to help your organization be less racist, for example. Those aren't very concrete. We won't know whether or not those have happened. So the more specific they can be, the better, so that we know whether or not we're moving toward them. We can set up our environment in ways that will make that as likely as possible for us, and watch our progress over time and not give up. So we're really going for sustainability here versus urgency. And then we always want to remain mindful of our impacts and who is being centered in our work. So the final takeaway today is just as challenging the gender binary leads to gender liberation for everyone, more access makes everything more accessible for everybody. These are my references. These are some more resources around disability justice, creating accessibility events, and neurodiversity. And here's my email address, and again, the link for the slides. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. August, can you stop sharing your slides, please?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So much to think about, for sure, and for all of us to act on after the thinking, or along with the thinking. August has agreed to take some questions, so I'm going to invite any of the participants with us right now to either raise your hand in the traditional or in the not so traditional way. Well, traditional way, waving is fine but unfortunately with this many people, which is a great problem to have, I can't see all your faces. You can put your hand up virtually, which is, if you're not familiar with that, is in the participants link, and then it says raise hand at the bottom. Or you can type your question into chat if that works for you, or otherwise unmute yourself and try to get my attention. And well, anyone have a question for August or comment on anything that came up? Josh?
Sure, I'll just start off with maybe a question about what do you think might be some good examples of more concrete sorts of goals that we might set for ourselves related to access or racism or cisnormativity, heteronormativity, these sorts of things?
Sure. I think that one that immediately comes to mind would be next time I'm getting together with people, or next time I have a meeting, I'm going to ask the group what the accessibility needs are. And if people don't know what that means, I'm going to give a little spiel. So I'm going to open up that conversation and kind of see what happens. I think another one would be to select some Black, Indigenous, and people of color disability justice writers and artists, and focus on like listening and reflecting and consuming that information. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions, comments, thoughts, reactions? Ann?
Yeah, I will say that I learned so much from your presentation, and I come from a place of really trying to learn about things, the range of ways that people are marginalized and oppressed. And you have taught me so much, and I thank you. And I will use your presentation for myself again and for my students. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the kind words, and please feel free to share any of those resources in the folder widely, like share them with anybody. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Mary. I had a question, just a general overarching question. Do you have any resources or I guess whether it be like videos or books that kind of differentiate, that talk more about white saviorism versus allyship, and what kind of additional actionable items we can do to ensure that we're coming at something from, you know, an allyship standpoint, not so much of the savior standpoint?
I definitely know that there's resources out there. Somebody's coming to mind in my field of behavior analysis who's done some work around that. If you could send me an email, I can see what resources I can put together and share them with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and my email address is upswingadvocates@gmail.com.
Thank you. Frida?
Hi, my name is Frida. Sorry, I always have a question.
No, don't be sorry.
So one of the things that you mentioned about eye contact really struck with me, because I work with autistic children, and I know that's one of the things in ABA therapy that we work on, is making eye contact.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if I really have a question, but I just wanted to comment on it, because it is a little bit difficult. As you said, it might be even painful for them. And then there's also the cultural aspect where in some cultures it's rude to make eye contact with your elders.
Right, yeah, thank you so much for that comment. That is one of the comments that's sort of like, that I've been focusing on my work through this past year, is looking at those sort of cultural behaviors and like what sort of ableist status quos are we perpetuating through our, what we're calling therapy, and are they actually harming the people that we're working with? So not only is like high levels of eye contact pretty culturally inappropriate in a lot of situations, it's really based on neurotypical people's comfort and wanting neurodivergent folks to do that. And so I think it should absolutely not be a target to work on unless a client themselves says, I'd like to work on making more eye contact because X, Y, Z, like that. Sure, absolutely, and you can talk through that, but I have a hard line of like, no, you should not focus on that. There was research done by, I believe the name is Hajikani and colleagues, who did, who looked at like brain activity when autistic adults were being asked to do something like experimentally that was equivalent, and they showed like distress and pain, and which I think is, you know, important to know. Yeah. And there's also no, I've looked there, I haven't found any research that supports that eye contact facilitates learning or that it facilitates like social development. But there are a lot of reports that actually requiring eye contact makes it harder to learn and harder to listen to people. So yeah, I think for some people, they can either pick making eye contact or hearing what's being said, but they can't do both. So we absolutely need flexibility around those requirements, for sure.
Very interesting, thank you. Mary, I think you were next.
I just wanted to reiterate the thank yous. Lou Doty, who is also here, and I are teaching a philosophy of human abilities class next semester. And of course, we'll be careful to define oppression and do these other things. And of course, we'll talk about intersectionality, but you really helped me think about this specific faces of intersectionality. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Eric?
Hi, one thing that really caught my eye and my ear as you talked was the high percentage of people who are autistic who have non-binary gender choices. I hadn't seen that, or non-binary gender expression, excuse me. And that was data I had never seen before. So, you know, that's something that there are autistic people in my family, and so that's something that I'm queuing on. I just wanted to thank you for mentioning that, and if there are other resources around that, I think you listed some in your presentation, so I'll follow up on that, but thank you for sharing that.
Of course, and feel free to send me an email if you want to like talk about that further. I'm happy to.
Sure. Thank you.
There's a question in the chat here. My daughter, who has a congenital limb difference, referred to herself today when talking to friends as disabled. We've never used that term with her, and it always has had a negative connotation. Is the term disabled being embraced more by people with visible and invisible differences? I would say yes, for sure. I know people who say I'm disabled, or they talk about disabled people. And it's not seen as a negative thing. It's not seen as a derogatory thing. So it may just be that your daughter is figuring out what language resonates most for her. And that language might shift over time, and that's okay. But I think that gets back to the preference of like identity first versus person first language. So some people might say, I'm a person with a disability. Other people might say, I'm a disabled person. It's just whatever feels best for each individual.
Lou?
So I would like to have your one overall piece of advice to give to future teachers.
To give to future teachers. Ooh, that's big. Let's see. I guess notice your own responding, notice your thoughts, your emotions, your assumptions, and create space for your learners to tell you what they need. Create space to find out their name and their pronoun, as well as like the ways they learn best and their modifications. Thank you for that question.
Just to comment on Lou's question, I was actually thinking after your talk, or wrote down a note for myself that I think one thing I can do as an educator is to intentionally ask my students, and I don't mean to ask them to, you know, publicly verbally say that, but, you know, give them an email option or hand out an index card in the old-fashioned way if they want to jot down a note or whatever, to what can I do to make our classroom experience more effective for you? So asking them, as you say, you know, maybe there are things that just are not immediately apparent, and or that they don't feel comfortable sharing. You know, I need to stand up, I need to sit in the back row, not to ignore you, but I need to lean against them, or whatever it is, you know, however they process things. That just even, I guess exactly what you're saying, to intentionally create space for them to communicate that in a comfortable way, that you're asking everyone that to share whenever they feel comfortable sharing that kind of thing. I guess that's one thing I would encourage your future teachers, Lou, to do.
Yeah, because people will share things that you would never think of in a million years, because everybody's brain is different. And even very young learners can impress us by what they know about themselves and how they learn best too.
Josh?
Sure, just sort of as a follow-up on that. So this makes me think a lot about sort of mastery learning, teaching to emphasize mastery rather than, you know, just to memorize facts or to reach some sort of criterion, right? So how might you, I guess it's so tough to emphasize mastery in many of these contexts where the structures and the systems don't let us or don't enable us to do that. So I don't know, any sort of thoughts or meditations on how we can maybe act systemically to shift as educators and maybe just as society members to make that shift?
Yeah, what a great question. We are absolutely working within systems where it's a one size fits all and you have to do it one time. Otherwise, you're out. Whenever possible, I really advocate like a personalized system of instruction kind of model where you have a set of everything that needs to be mastered, but people can do it on their own timeline and give multiple opportunities or multiple types of additional practice when people need it. It's definitely more steps on the instructor's part, and I think it can also be exponentially way more meaningful to do things in that way. Yeah, I think ultimately it does come down to the conversation piece too. So like checking in with students about the mastery level, because sometimes there are modifications where a task can look a little bit different, but it still assesses the same skill, or still assesses the same level of competency. We can think creatively.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Lou?
I just wanted to say, back to connecting with students and asking them, one thing I do around the middle of the course, rather than do this heavy duty course evaluation, when I'm getting them in right now, I do something that's called wishes and pluses. And they reveal so much with that opportunity. It's been, and then I usually try to grant one wish. So it works out.
I love that. Yeah, creating regular opportunities for people to give feedback and then actually implementing the feedback and changing what you're doing. It not only is it helpful in an instructional sense, it really builds trust too in the classroom to be able to engage meaningfully. I think that's really awesome that you're doing that. There's a question here. Somebody says, I had a student in a small seminar class who identified himself as having ADHD. He asked if he could pace around during class. There were only 3 other students and no one minded, or at least no one said they did. What if the other students had found his pacing distracting or had expressed it? How would you recommend handling a situation like that? Great question. I think that's a good example of sometimes when, well, we don't know, but there may have been competing access needs, or maybe it was totally fine. So I think checking in with each person and then doing that as a group, I think could allow for people to kind of collaborate together. Like, how can we work together to create a learning environment where the student's able to pace, but it's not too distracting to this other student because they're able to wear headphones, for example, or something like that. Yeah, I think it's a good opportunity just for a conversation and collaboration. And also sometimes people do have competing access needs. And so the space may need to be modified or the tasks may need to be modified or something like that.
I think Mary or Bill, please, I was hoping you would share something. Those of you that didn't catch that in the beginning or joined us a few moments late, Scott mentioned that Reverend Bill Johnson is with us, and we are so happy. And it's great to see you again, Bill. But he was just asking to share. Let's see. I think I can unmute you, or let's see. You're muted. Let's see. Let me. I think I am. There we go. Great. Thank you.
There are many challenges to aging.
Tell me about it.
This is one. I want to say thank you, August, for a wonderful lecture. And it's been very enlightening to me. In a retirement community, we live with many diminishments. And we also around here, we have learned that as we are able to share the way we have experienced diminishment and the way we experience disabilities, which everyone has in one form or another, no matter what your age is, we open up the opportunity for others to communicate about their own. And that's been fundamental, and you gave many wonderful insights in your lecture that I look forward to sharing with our administration and our my neighbors, because And I'm so glad I can have them access this lecture and hear it for themselves, because I think we're never too old to learn about these things. All of which, this is a lot of new language, a lot of new concepts for many of us, but it's been a wonderful hour plus with you, and thank you so much for accepting the invitation.
Thank you so much for the kind words, and I'm really honored to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bill. Whoops. And thank you, Bill, for being you that enabled us to start this lecture in your name. Any final questions, comments? I think it's about time for us to close this. I know, not closing our thinking on it, but just the time. And August has to move on to yet again one more commitment for us here. So I'm gonna give them a little break too. Any final thoughts? Well, then please just join me in thanking August very much for this wonderful presentation. And clap in any number of ways now. We have all these tools at our disposal. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks.